My name is Todd Hickey, and I am curator of the Bancroft's collection of papyri and chair of this session entitled Ancient Egypt. Since our title is rather broad, and to avoid any buyer's remorse, I should tell you that our concern for the next hour or so will not be Egypt of the pharaohs, but Egypt after the pharaohs. That is Greco-Roman Egypt, the Egypt of the Library and Museum of Alexandria, of the Rosetta Stone, of Antony and Cleopatra. The program's dramatic chronological shift from California in the 20th century to Egypt at the dawn of the first millennium might be a bit jarring. See the mic off? Okay. Might be a bit jarring, but really it is quite fitting that a presentation concerning the last phase of ancient Egyptian history and culture be part of a celebration of Bancroft. I say this because one would have to go to Europe or to Egypt itself to find more primary source material for the study of the splendidly diverse society that is the concern, or our concern rather, this afternoon. Bancroft, in fact, possesses the largest collection of Greco-Roman papyri this side of Oxford. There are approximately 36,000 fragments. And it houses one of the world's top-tier institutes for papyrological study, the Center for the Tebtunis Papyri. But the papyri also have a close connection to Bancroft's core business, if you will, to California history, which they engaged through the person of Phoebe Apperson Hearst. It was Mrs. Hearst who financed their discovery, the excavation of the ruins of the village of Tebtunis in the winter of 1899-1900, as part of her efforts to elevate the University of California to new levels of scholarly excellence and breadth. For our tour of Bancroft's ancient texts this afternoon, we are fortunate to have two distinguished guides, one of which hasn't arrived. Nonetheless, I will introduce him in the hopes that he will arrive. Professor Michael Haslam, who isn't here, of the Department of Classics of the University of California at Los Angeles, and Dr. Brian Muhs of the Papyrological Institute of Leiden University. Professor Haslam, who was to lead things off with a discussion of Greek literature in the collection, received his BA and PhD from the University of London, where he was trained by the great Eric Turner. He's a world-renowned expert in literary papyrology and has contributed text to a dozen volumes of papyrology's flagship series, the Oxyrhynchus Papyri. Dr. Muhs, who will address our long underexploited Egyptian language texts, was a Cal undergrad and received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. He has worked in over a dozen collections and recently published an edition of the Ptolemaic Ostraca in the Oriental Institute Museum of the University of Chicago. He knows the Egyptian portion of our collection better than anyone and is a co-editor of a forthcoming volume of our series, the Tebtunis Papyri. Please join me in welcoming, I was going to say both, but welcoming Brian back to Berkeley.
Thank you. I am really pleased to be here today to help celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Bancroft Library. As a Cal graduate, and also my first teaching position was at Cal. It's really nice to come back here. Today, I want to help celebrate the centennial of the Bancroft Library by examining the relationships between the modern Bancroft Library, ancient Egyptian libraries, the Tebtunis Papyri, and the Greek and Egyptian ocean of stories. I will begin by explaining what I mean by ocean of stories, with the help of an Indo-Arabian parallel. The ocean of stories, or more correctly, the ocean of streams of stories, is the title of a collection of stories written in Sanskrit in Kashmir in the 11th century AD by the author Somadeva. The introduction states that it is based on a series of stories told by the god Shiva to his wife Parvati. These stories were overheard by a group of demigods who were condemned to translate them and retell them on earth until they became famous and were written down. Curiously, some of the same stories in the ocean of stories are similar and clearly related to those in the Arabian Nights, written in Arabic in Baghdad in the 9th century AD. The modern author Salman Rushdie, in his fantasy Harun and the Sea of Stories, cleverly describes the relationship between the Sanskrit ocean of stories and the Arabian Nights, using the image of a very literal ocean of stories, from which storytellers draw inspiration like water from a tap. In the name of multicultural, multilingual intertextuality, I too will use this metaphor. I want to talk about another ocean of stories, however, which circulated in Egypt between the 5th century BC and the 3rd century AD. Both Greek and Egyptian storytellers drew from this ocean, and some of their stories were preserved in the ancient libraries of the town of Tebtunis in Egypt. Some of these stories were written in Greek and were preserved in private libraries and as waste paper reused to make mummy wrappings until they were excavated and sent to the Bancroft Library. Other of these stories were written in the Egyptian language and were preserved in the temple library of Tebtunis until they too were excavated and sent to libraries in Copenhagen, Florence, as well as to the Bancroft. Some of these stories show the influence of both the Greek and the Egyptian literary traditions. One could say that these stories belong to an ocean of intertextuality, much like the Indo-Arabian ocean of stories. Furthermore, it is possible to say quite a bit about the nature of the Greco-Egyptian ocean of stories, thanks to the non-literary and documentary papyri from private houses and mummy wrappings now in the Bancroft Library. These shed light on how Greek and Egyptian storytellers may have come into contact with, absorbed, modified, and disseminated their stories. Before discussing the Greco-Egyptian ocean of stories, however, I would like to very briefly discuss the role of libraries in preserving and transmitting the ancient Greek and Egyptian literary traditions. The history of the classical Greek literary tradition is fairly well known, so I will just summarize it here for the purpose of comparison. Hellenistic rulers like the Ptolemies in Egypt established libraries like the one in Alexandria, which collected and compared manuscripts to produce standard editions of canonical works. These standard editions were then copied and preserved in numerous private libraries, and in this way, the manuscript tradition could survive the loss of individual manuscripts and even libraries. Roman and Byzantine libraries continued this work until the fall of their respective empires, when monastic libraries then took up the task. Decreasing interest in Greek literary works, however, meant that many works were copied in abridged form, if at all, and many were lost as last manuscripts decayed. This trend was only reversed when Renaissance scholars began to collect and compare manuscripts to produce standard editions of the surviving classical works, and the printing press made it possible to disseminate these editions widely. The Egyptian literary traditions, in contrast to the Greek tradition, did not extend to the present in an unbroken chain. The dry climate of Egypt has nonetheless preserved numerous literary manuscripts and fragments. These papyri suggest that libraries may also have played an important role in the canonization and the preservation of the two Egyptian literary traditions. The first tradition was formed at the beginning, and here I am going to talk about Pharaonic Egypt briefly. The first tradition was formed at the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, around 2100 BC, and survived at least until the end of the New Kingdom, around 1200 BC. These stories were written in classical or Middle Egyptian, which was probably closely related to the language spoken in the Middle Kingdom, and were written in the script known as hieratic, a cursive form of hieroglyphs suited to writing on papyrus. Many literary texts from the first tradition portray the Middle Kingdom pharaohs sympathetically or advocate the social order established by them. This suggests that these texts may have originated in this royal court. Literary texts from the first tradition have survived in several small private libraries and in tombs as substitutes for mortuary papyri. Extracts and sometimes complete copies of literary works have been found on limestone flakes and on the back of administrative papyri, suggesting that they were copied as school exercises, possibly as part of a canonical curriculum. One finds the same stories over and over again. This first literary tradition began to die out toward the ends of the New Kingdom. Fewer copies of older works were preserved, perhaps because the spoken language was evolving ever further away from classical or Middle Egyptian. Increasing numbers of new literary works are attested in this period, written in a mixture of the classical and vernacular languages. The first literary tradition seems to have finally died out in the Third Intermediate Period, which lasted from around 1000 BC to 700 BC, during which time Egypt was divided into numerous principalities, and from which time no literary works are attested. In contrast, religious texts, such as the Book of the Dead, are attested and survived long after the end of the first literary tradition. Apparently, there were libraries of some sort during this period, but their keepers had different priorities than the defunct royal court. The second Egyptian literary tradition experienced a false dawn when Egypt was reunited by the Saite dynasty from 650 to 525 BC. Several literary works were written in the classical hieratic, and most focused, again, on the role of the king in maintaining cosmic and social order. This brief flourish of court literature soon came to an end, however, when Egypt was conquered by the Persian Empire in 525 BC. With a few exceptions, ancient Egypt had lost its independence, passing from the Persians to Alexander the Great in 332 BC, and from Alexander's successors, the Ptolemies, to the Roman Emperor Augustus in 30 BC. The second Egyptian literary tradition really began in the Ptolemaic period, around 300 BC, and continued well into the Roman period, until 200 AD. These stories were written in Demotic, an extremely cursive script derived from hieratic, and used to represent the vernacular that had evolved away from classical Egyptian during the preceding 1500 years. Demotic literary texts from the second tradition frequently seem to reflect priestly rather than court perspectives, in contrast to the first tradition or the brief Saite revival. This is not surprising, given that Egypt was under foreign rule and there were no native Egyptian courts at this time. The priestly perspective can be seen in content, which frequently concerned rulers, magicians, and magical texts from Egypt's then already long past. Due to low literacy rates and the lack of an Egyptian court, the Egyptian priests probably had a near monopoly on literacy in Demotic texts, and certainly concerning the ancient hieroglyphic and hieratic texts that preserved Egypt's oldest history and magical and ritual texts. Demotic literary texts about powerful magical and ritual texts and ancient rulers and magicians therefore underscored the importance of priests as guardians of Egypt's cultural heritage. This priestly self-promotion was not unjustified. Some Demotic literary texts have been found in tombs, apparently again as substitutes for mortuary papyri. The vast majority of Demotic literary texts, however, come from two Egyptian temple libraries, abandoned at the end of the 2nd or the beginning of the 3rd centuries AD, and rediscovered only in the 20th century. The contents of the temple library of Soknopionesos are now primarily in Berlin and Vienna, while the contents of the temple library of Tebtunis are now mostly in Copenhagen, Florence, and of course, in the Bancroft. Having briefly discussed the role of libraries in preserving and transmitting the ancient Greek and Egyptian literary traditions, I would now like to discuss how these two traditions occasionally combined in Tebtunis libraries to create a Greco-Egyptian ocean of stories. I will do this by discussing two literary works attested in multiple fragmentary copies in the Tebtunis Temple Library. The first of these is the story of Petiezus, son of Petatum, and 70 other good and bad stories. The story of Petiezus, son of Petatum, is a frame story which served to tie together 70 unrelated stories, of which only a handful are preserved. It is possible that the frame story was part of an even larger story cycle involving the high priests of the god Atum in Heliopolis, but this is not yet certain. A lot of the material from the Tebtunis and the Soknapionesos temple libraries is not yet published. This is a work in progress. What is certain is that Petiezus, son of Petatum, was a high priest of Atum who was adept in magic. One day he used his magic to force a ghost to ask Osiris, the god of the dead, how long Petiezus would live. The ghost rather irritatingly replied that Petatum only had 40 days to live. Petatum used 5 of these days to collect his debts and to prepare his tomb and his burial. Then he enchanted a series of wax figures to collect stories to entertain him, one story about good women and one story about bad women for each of his remaining 35 days. One of these stories concerns a king who has gone blind. The king consults an oracle and is told that to recover his eyesight, he must wash his eyes in the tears of a faithful woman. The king summons woman after woman, but of course, none of their tears cure him. The king begins to despair until he finally finds a woman whose tears cure him. The king then marries the woman, perhaps out of gratitude, or perhaps because she was the only faithful woman in Egypt. In addition to its misogynism, this story is of interest because of its long history. Evidently, it was popular. The 2 manuscripts of Petiezus from Tebtunis date to the 1st and the 2nd centuries AD. Another manuscript of Petiezus from Saqqara dates to the 4th century BC, showing that this manuscript tradition spanned almost 500 years. The story of the blind king in Petiezus, however, is even older, because 100 years earlier, in the 5th century BC, the Greek historian Herodotus included it in his brief history of Egypt, which he says is based on what Egyptian priests told him. Ironically, Herodotus attributes this story to an otherwise unattested king, Pharaoh, which is clearly a misunderstanding of the Egyptian word for king, pharaoh. Furthermore, Herodotus's Greek version differs from the Demotic Egyptian version at several points. For example, the use of urine rather than tears to wash the king's eyes. The story of the blind king in Petiezus illustrates one of the ways in which the Greco-Egyptian ocean of stories was created, and how it interacted with the Greek and Egyptian literary traditions through the incorporation of oral traditions in the literary canons. Egyptian priests told a story to Herodotus, who wrote it in his manuscript, which became part of the classical Greek literary tradition. Meanwhile, the Egyptian priests favored this story so much that they incorporated it among the 70 good and bad stories of Petiezus, which then became part of the second Egyptian literary tradition. The second literary work from Tebtunis that I want to discuss today is the story of the battle for the armor of Inaros. The battle for the armor of Inaros is a straightforward narrative, not a frame story, but it is definitely part of a longer story cycle involving the hero Inaros, his children, and their rivals, King Petabast and his children and allies. This story is set in the Third Intermediate Period, when Egypt was divided into a number of principalities only nominally under the authority of the kings in Tanis. The first story in the cycle deals with the life of the hero Inaros, who defends Egypt against the Assyrians. The Assyrian king's magician unsuccessfully tries to defeat Inaros with various magical ruses, and finally assumes the form of a griffin. Inaros slays the griffin and makes his armor from the griffin's hide. The battle for the armor of Inaros picks up much later, after Inaros' death. The god Osiris decides to create a conflict between the two leading families in Egypt, perhaps for his amusement, it's not clear, and sends demons to possess Inaros' son, Pami, and the pharaoh's general, Werti-Ameneut. Werti-Ameneut steals the armor of Inaros from Pami, and Pami calls upon all the other children of Inaros to join him in going to war against Werti-Ameneut. King Petabast futilely attempts to maintain the peace by organizing a huge memorial service for Inaros and demanding that Werti-Ameneut return the armor. But Pami sulks, refuses to attend the service, and announces that Inaros can only be properly honored through battle for his armor. Pami and Werti-Ameneut exchange heated letters and make an appointment to meet for battle. Pami shows up with one boatload of soldiers, but Werti-Ameneut is joined by King Petabast's son, Prince Ankor, and things look bad for Pami. Fortunately, Inaros' other sons show up just in time, and there follows a laundry list of princes, principalities, and boatloads of soldiers. Now that the odds are more equal, the battle resolves itself into a series of single combats between the sons of Inaros on the one hand and Werti-Ameneut and his allies on the other. The superior fighting skills of the blood of Inaros begins to show when King Petabast shows up and announces that Pami has won the combat and can reclaim the armor of Inaros without dishonoring Inaros, and everyone lives happily ever after, at least until the next story. The battle for the armor of Inaros has sparked controversy ever since a copy from the Soknopau-Nasos Temple Library was published at the beginning of the 20th century. At first, scholars were struck by the parallels to Homer's Iliad. Sullen Pami is more than a little reminiscent of wrathful Achilles. The armor of Inaros has similarities to Achilles' armor. The laundry list of princes, principalities, and boats recollects the infamous Homeric catalog of ships. And the single combats between princes are also strikingly Homeric. More recently, however, some scholars have defended the Egyptianness of the battle for Inaros' armor. The whole story is written in prose rather than poetry. There is a much higher proportion of direct speech in Inaros' armor than in Homer. Laundry lists are not uncommon in Egyptian literature, nor in fact are single combats. Think of Sinuhe. In short, Inaros' armor presents a puzzle. It clearly belongs to the Greco-Egyptian ocean of stories, but it is difficult to see exactly where the contributions of the Greek and Egyptian traditions begin and end, in marked contrast to the story of the blind king in Petiesa and in Herodotus. Having briefly, this is where the bulk of the Bancroft Tebtunis Papyri come back into this story. The Greek and Demotic papyri in the Bancroft Library were found in the winter of 1899 and 1900 by Grenfell and Hunt on behalf of Phoebe Apperson Hearst. Grenfell and Hunt excavated numerous Ptolemaic period mummies of humans and crocodiles wrapped in discarded papyri. as well as a number of Roman period houses of Egyptian priests that also contain papyri. The majority of these papyri are non-literary. The papyri from the mummies included many long administrative papyri with lists of taxpayers and personal tax payments, list of landowners, plots of land, harvest tax payments, list of contracts and sales tax payments, copies of incoming orders and decrees, and copies of outgoing reports and correspondence, all apparently sold as scrap to the embalmers when they were no longer relevant. And the papyri from the houses included many contracts, receipts, and letters. These non-literary papyri may seem a far cry from the literary works that I discussed earlier, but in fact these Bancroft Tebtunis Papyri provide a key to understanding the Greco-Egyptian ocean of stories, by illustrating the social context of the Greek and Egyptian literary traditions and libraries in Tebtunis. The earliest Bancroft Tebtunis Papyri come from the wrappings of human mummies. They date to the beginning of the Ptolemaic period, to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, and come from both Tebtunis and surrounding villages. Many of these papyri are written in Demotic. Some Demotic papyri come from the temple of the god Sokno-Tunis in the center of Tebtunis, or from one of the smaller temples in the outlying villages. Other Demotic papyri come from local offices of the royal administration and concern the registration of people and property and the collection of taxes. The interest of governments in taxes goes back to the beginning of time. Other papyri from the human mummies were written in Greek. Some Greek papyri are the private records of Greeks who were given plots of farmland in the Egyptian countryside by Ptolemaic kings in return for the obligation to serve in the Ptolemaic army when called up. The Ptolemies, being of Macedonian Greek descent, favored Greeks in their armies. These Greek settlers were allowed to conduct their business and business records in Greek, according to Greek law, even though the majority of the population used Demotic and Demotic law. Other Greek papyri come from the local offices of the royal administration. The Ptolemies favored Greeks in the upper levels of the royal administration as well as in their armies. The lower levels of the royal administration were largely staffed by native Egyptians, but the Ptolemies encouraged them to learn at least some Greek and to submit at least summaries of their work in Greek so that their superiors could audit their work. The Bancroft Tebtunis papyri from the wrappings of crocodile mummies are for the most part later than those from human mummies and date from the end of the Ptolemaic period to the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. There are still many purely Demotic papyri in this period, mostly from the temples or from the associations of priests who paraded mummies of crocodiles around the towns and villages on holidays. Sacred animals were viewed as manifestations or representations of the god, and parades of mummified animals allowed the Egyptian population a rare chance to come into contact with their gods. The gods were normally worshipped in the form of statues in temples behind high walls, through which only ritually pure priests could enter. There are, however, increasing numbers of Greek and bilingual papyri in this period. After the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC, the Ptolemies began to employ Egyptians in their armies, as well as Greeks. The Egyptians served under Greek commanders and presumably had to learn some Greek, but they were encouraged by receiving plots of land larger than those held by most Egyptian farmers, though smaller than those held by Greek soldiers. Some of these Egyptians, therefore, began to conduct their business in Greek rather than Egyptian. Similarly, royal officials, even at the local levels, conducted their business at least partially in Greek. For example, I am currently preparing to publish a number of papyri from a contract registration office in one of the villages near Tebtunis. Every contract written in Ptolemaic Egypt, Greek or Demotic, had to be registered, and of course, the appropriate fees and taxes paid before it was valid. The papyri that I am studying concern mostly demotic contracts, and most of the registration records are in demotic as well. But at the bottom of each column, the totals of the fees and taxes are also given in Greek. And at the end of each papyrus is a summary in Greek, so that the finances could be audited. It is clear that this office was run by an Egyptian fluent in demotic who knew a smattering of Greek. Unlike most Egyptians who wrote with a brush, however, he used a Greek pen, even though most of his work was in demotic. Most Egyptians who wrote demotic used a brush. Furthermore, in his personal accounts, he records regular expenditures for bath oil. Egyptians, when they bathed, tended to use a kind of soap based on natron, the salt used in embalming. Greeks, however, used oil at the public baths, which were centers of Greek cultural life. Clearly, this lower Egyptian official was trying to impress his Greek bosses. The Bancroft Tebtunis Papyri from the priest houses are the latest of those excavated by Grenfell and Hunt, and date to the Roman period between the 1st and the 3rd centuries AD. There are very few demotic papyri from this period, except for a few stray literary, religious, and magical papyri from the Tebtunis Temple Library. The vast majority of the papyri from the houses in this period are Greek, even those from the private archives of Egyptian priests, such as that of Isidora and Cronion, which is being published by Todd Hickey. The Romans do not seem to have outlawed demotic, but they do seem to have requested Greek summaries on all legal documents now, on private contracts as well as administrative documents, which made demotic increasingly superfluous and Greek increasingly necessary to conduct business. Consequently, even Egyptian priests found it necessary to learn and write in Greek, even as they tried to preserve their own written heritage in demotic in their libraries. The Bancroft Tebtunis Papyri therefore show a clear trend that first ambitious Egyptians, and later powerful ones as well, were pressured to learn Greek. Some may have learned on the job, but others probably learned in schools by copying excerpts from the Greek classics, judging from the presence of such excerpts among the administrative papyri, and knowing that the most common school text was Homer's Iliad, helps explain the puzzle of the Greek influence in the battle for the armor of Anaros. The later Egyptian priests may have learned the Greek classics at school alongside the Egyptian classics, allowing the two traditions to mix in their heads and subtly and simultaneously influence new compositions. In conclusion, today I've argued that the ancient Egyptian libraries stood on the shores of an ocean of stories. Oral stories circulating in the ocean were sometimes collected and written down on papyri, like the 70 good and bad stories of Pedieza, and sometimes became part of literary canons preserved in the libraries. The choice of stories and papyri that were thus preserved illustrate the values of the keepers of the libraries and the groups that supported them. In ancient Egypt, most often priests. New stories entering the ocean of stories, in turn, sometimes referred to these literary canons, as in the case of the Battle of the for the Armor of Anaros, and its apparent references to Homer. Listening to the other lecturers in the Centennial Symposium, I am convinced that the Bancroft has continued the work of the ancient Egyptian libraries by collecting and preserving the Tebtunis Papyri and other special collections, and allowing scholars to use them in their contributions to the ocean of academic stories. May it continue to do so for many years. Thank you.